She did bring 3D. Yeah, but camera doesn't show you. We got one of us picking up apartment. Mike's physical therapy.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the PSU Friday Transportation Seminar.
And, you know, we've done these seminars for a long time, and our original dream was to get students to organize the seminar series. We've not achieved that to date, but we're always especially happy when our students are actually the presenters. And so today, I'm very happy to introduce Darwin Moosavi, who's a MERP student, and on behalf of his workshop team. So the MERP students do a workshop every year, and this happens to be a great workshop project focused on low-density transit solutions for Salem-Keizer. So Darwin, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Well, as Dr. Bertini said, I'm here to talk about Capturing the Ride, which is a low-density flexible transit project in Salem-Keizer that myself and 5 other of my peers have been doing as part of our capstone project for the Masters in Urban and Regional Planning program here at PSU. So Capturing the Ride, as I said, is focusing on low-density transit options in Salem-Keizer. We are doing a 6-month-long community outreach intensive planning process in the Salem-Keizer region. And I'll talk a little more about what we're exactly doing in a bit. So our team consists of CJ Doxey, Mike Sellinger, Lauren Wurtis, myself, Brenda Martin, and Matt Bergen. Together, we are a student consultant group called Paradigm Planning. Our project, as I said, is in Salem, the Salem-Keizer region, just south of here in the Willamette Valley. And our client that we've been working with is Chariots, which is the Salem-Keizer Transit Agency. And Chariots runs bus service for the entire Salem-Keizer region, as well as a paratransit service called Cherry Lift, and then a regional transit system called CARTS. Our project mainly focuses on 3 study areas looking at the Chariots lines, the bus lines in those areas. So the mission of our project is basically to allow greater accessibility to transit by expanding coverage with flexible transit solutions, while also ensuring the needs of transit-dependent populations, seniors, and people with disabilities are accommodated. So, you know, as you can see, there's targeted populations that we were trying to reach, and community outreach was a big part of our approach in our project and what we wanted to do. The 3 study areas that we mainly focused on in this project are Keizer, West Salem, and South Salem. These 3 areas have a very familiar suburban grid pattern, with the whole loops and lollipops that we're very familiar with. And all 3 areas are fairly low density, very suburban. You can compare the grids to the downtown grid. As you can see, not a lot of through streets, not really gridded. And part of the problem here is, as what we've seen happening in a lot of other parts of the country, as transit service has been cut due to budget reasons, ridership has dropped, which has created a cycle of further cuts. And a lot of the places that have been the hardest hit in this region are these 3 outlying areas, where the suburban grid makes it very inefficient for regular fixed route bus, and due to that, there's low ridership, which then makes those lines first in line to get cut when additional cuts are made. So, it's been an ongoing problem for quite a while in the region, and it's left those 3 areas with, fairly bare bones structure where a lot of areas are not met, and there's not full coverage in those study areas. And there are circulator routes currently in those places, which mean that there are loop bus routes that help gather people and connect them to other lines to transfer out of the neighborhood. And those in particular have been very inefficient. So to give you a little more of an understanding of the three study areas in comparison to the region as a whole, one of the things that pops out to me when I look at this is that the median incomes are all higher, the level of minority populations are lower, not as many households with no cars, and poverty is lower as well. So that might make you think, why are these three areas very important, especially if we're looking at a transit-dependent population and taking an equity approach? And the answer is simply that there's still an equity issue here. These areas have the least amount of service and the hardest street pattern to work with. So although these numbers may indicate that these regions have less of a population in need than the overall region, the riders for chariots are about 60 to 70% transit dependent. So since it is a bare bones structure in terms of their the transit that they provide, most people who rely on it, or most people who use it, are people who rely on it, which means that in these areas there are still large populations that need this service. You can also take note that the senior population is higher in these three areas than in the region. So the aging in place issue is actually becoming more and more of a problem in these study areas. So that's another reason why we focused on seniors with our approach. So as I mentioned earlier, our project is about flexible transit. So a lot of you might be wondering what that exactly means. So the easiest way to describe it is that it falls in between on the spectrum of fixed route and demand responsive bus service. So fixed route being your standard bus service that we have here in Portland that's provided by TriMet, a bus line with fixed stops on a main street without any sort of deviation or ability to go off that route. Demand responsive is, more commonly known as dial-a-ride. You basically would have to call to ask to get picked up and can usually get picked up or dropped off anywhere within the area that's covered. So a completely demand responsive system would mean that there are no points or places where you can get on and get off. It would have to be kind of like a cab where you call to get taken to your destination. Flexible transit is everything in between that spectrum. So it could be a combination of a fixed route with demand responsive features that let you deviate off the route or let you have stops that could be activated for people to use on an as-needed basis that are off the main route. And I'll talk a little more about this. So part of our goal with this project, like I said earlier, was to communicate, was to engage the community. And in order to do that, we really need to find a way to communicate effectively with them. Transit, as we all know, can be a pretty wonky world. There's a lot that comes with it that's kind of difficult to engage the general public with. Transit has a history of not reaching out to the general public with a lot of issues because of that, where there's definitely a disconnect in terms of all the data and numbers that go into figuring out efficiency of routes and getting people involved and being able to give their input and finding out their needs in order to make a better system. So we made 4 goals for ourselves of how we wanted to approach this project. The first one was we definitely wanted to listen to the community. And there's been a history with the Salem-Keizer Transit Agency where a lot of their constituents have been left feeling unheard. A lot of this has to do with obviously budgetary constraints of the amount of outreach they can do and just the traditional nature of transit, not always being fully engaged with the community in terms of getting in-depth feedback of what they want and serving those needs. So we wanted to help break that barrier a little bit and make sure that people felt heard. And part of that was also, engaging them and educating them on what we were going to do. We also wanted to create a comprehensive study, which meant that we wanted to look at what other people were doing in other places and make sure that, one, we didn't want to try to recreate the wheel. We wanted to see what else was out there, learn from best practices of other places, and make sure that we're getting a complete picture before we recommend anything. One goal that I think is very important in terms of our project, which is what I'm mainly here to talk about today, is the communicating effectively. And what I mean by this is that, like I said, there are, it's rather difficult at times to communicate detailed transit operations to, just the general public. So with flexible transit, which is a concept that even for the 6 of us took a lot of research to understand and fully comprehend, we were faced with a big challenge of, one, how do we effectively tell people what we're looking to do, and 2, how do we have them understand these concepts enough to be able to give us their feedback on how they feel about it. And obviously, with engaging the community, you have limited amounts of time, limited windows where you get to talk to someone. Oftentimes, it's not even direct communication. It may be online or through a survey. So, this was a big challenge for us, but I think it's what makes our project unique. So in 4, we wanted to develop a replicable framework of how to do goals 1, 2, and 3. So, part of what this means is, flexible transit is different in every agency or every municipality that decides to implement it. What is the same is the ideas and concepts behind how best to communicate these ideas to the public, and creating a framework for that was mainly what we wanted to do. So other agencies interested could learn from what worked well for us and our mistakes to know how to best approach people in the future. So here's kind of a quick overview of our process. I'll go in depth to all these steps in a bit, but in general, first we started with information gathering. All the existing conditions, best practices of what's happening elsewhere, figuring out the picture of what's in Salem-Keizer and the community's values and needs. Next was the flexible transit portion, where we said, okay, now we have a basic understanding of what's here. Now let's go educate people and get their feedback on what we're looking to propose. Then was the creation of our alternatives, which had a whole other round of engagement of getting people involved in what we had created based on all our information, and seeing how people felt about that, which is leading us now to our final recommendations, which is what we're currently working on. So first off, in terms of engaging people, obviously a way that you don't necessarily reach everyone, but is becoming more and more popular in terms of people having access to the internet. Website and Facebook helped us a lot in terms of getting the word out to the general public. Obviously, we have to do a lot more specialized outreach to reach certain communities. But these tools were mainly used just for a platform to get our information out there. We went to many neighborhood meetings. We hit up senior centers. We went to community centers, and we tried talking to as many people as possible. A lot of this was just informing people, giving them flyers about when our workshops were, getting them engaged and interested in the project, and telling them what we were here to do. We had what we call our rolling roadshow, where we actually got on the buses, rode the buses, and talked to people on all the bus lines that were within our study areas, and got to engage the riders who were on the buses, and learn a little more about them, who they are, what their needs are, and also disseminate information in terms of our project and how they could get more involved. This was one of our flyers that we used. We had 3 workshops, which I'll talk about further, which we tried, informing people about ahead of time to get them to come give their input on what we were doing. Next part of our information gathering was we went out and did intercept surveys. This was mainly getting at people's values, around transit. How often do they ride? What's the most important thing for them? Is it frequency? Is it making sure the bus is on time? How far are they willing to walk to a bus stop? Are they satisfied with their service? That kind of stuff. So more existing conditions of the current transit system. So we had about 100 or so intercept surveys collected over a 2-day period where the 6 of us went out. And the next part was an online survey. So the online survey asked kind of the same questions the intercept survey did, but was a little more in-depth because online people usually have a little more time than in passing in person. So we try to get a little more information. We had over 400 survey responses within our study areas through the online survey. So we only used information that was by people who either lived, worked, or traveled through our study areas, because we were trying to focus on those areas. Next came what I mentioned earlier, the concept of trying to illustrate to people what flexible transit is. So this is an illustration of 6 different types of flexible transit as shown in a TCRP report. And as you can see, it's a little difficult to understand. Obviously, these come with a lot of text of explaining how they work. But it took us a little bit of time to understand what was going on in these concepts. So we tried thinking, how can we, one, effectively communicate this to community, but 2, make it so we can better describe these things and understand them in a way where we can talk to someone and tell them in 2 sentences what's going on. So we took those ideas and created diagrams that we thought made a little more sense and were a little more based in reality of what a street network would look like, homes, major streets. Still would need an explanation, but can easier get at the point of what's going on if you had a legend to point out what each characteristic of the routes are. We still thought that this was a little complicated and would be a little difficult for the public to understand, so we decided to make it even simpler. So we created what we call the deviator and the hopper. So the deviator is basically a fixed route where a bus can deviate and go off of it to pick up people who either call in from their home or at a designated activated stop that could be turned on demand. And obviously there's different variations of this because these 2 concepts boil out of those, come out of those 6. So, but to us, this helped get the main idea across, that there's still a fixed bus line. It's just the ability of being able to get picked up from off of that line. The hopper is a little more on the demand responsive side. So this would be a zone without a fixed line. It could have potential stops that are permanent, like the solid green ones there. Or it could be purely demand responsive where you have to call to activate that stop to get picked up. But the point of this is that people would get picked up in this zone and then brought to a transfer point to then get on a fixed line to get to where they're going. So as you can see, this falls into the middle of the spectrum between regular bus and dial-a-ride. And this is just an example of one of the posters we use at our workshop to try to get people understanding this concept. We used chariots at one end and chairlift at the other, concepts that they were familiar with, to try to show where these fall in the spectrum. So at our workshops, we used a lot of visual tools and a lot of one-on-one time with people to try to educate them on these concepts before we could get their feedback. We used 6 different case studies at the workshop of different systems from around the country that kind of fell into the category of the 6 other types that I originally mentioned, but without using those original terms and relating them to the deviator and the hopper to make it a little easier to understand and show that these are all just variations of that same concept. We then made this diagram where we have a spectrum for different trade-offs that come with these kinds of services. So, for example, if everything on this side is more of a fixed type of service, while the lighter green side is more demand responsive. So obviously you can pull levers back and forth and create your own type of system, but it comes with trade-offs between these as well. So for example, area covered, if it's only going on main streets, that's most likely a fixed line. If it's covering all of Salem-Keizer, that's like a dial-a-ride system where the entire area is covered by that one bus or one type of service. And this is the same for all of these. So at the workshops, we had these table maps where we had little bus icons that we used on the table and drew out kind of parts of our diagrams that we showed earlier to help illustrate to people how these worked. So we got to walk people through basically what the deviator would do and what the hopper would do, and related back to their day-to-day experiences on transit in terms of, their trips that they're making and how this service would impact them positively or negatively, because we wanted to know if this was something that would work for them to get more coverage at potential loss of either frequency or, other trade-offs that may come with it. So we held these workshops. Another example of something we did at the workshops was we had a map where people got to mark important destinations that they went to, or community destinations in the area that we may not have been aware of. We also collected this kind of data through our online surveys, and we're able to map all the destinations that people thought were significant in the area. We actually got very rich responses from our workshop surveys after the workshops when we were out in the community. As I'll talk about a little bit later, we also did a flexible transit survey online, and people did understand a lot of the concepts, but we saw a noticeable difference in terms of people's responses from the workshop of actually being there and being able to talk to us, and their understanding of the concepts and the feedback was a lot richer than people who purely took the survey online. So we held a workshop in each neighborhood, one in Keizer, one in South Salem, and one in West Salem. And like I said, we also had this information online in a flexible transit survey. So this was a little difficult in terms of trying to communicate the same concepts we communicated in person online in a short enough amount of time where someone could learn and also give us feedback and not get bored of what they're doing. So it was a little challenging, but we did get over, I believe, 50 survey responses online. Not as high as our original one, which makes sense, but we were able to engage people, and most everyone seemed to understand the concepts. There's obviously, we could tell, a varied level of understanding, and we structured our questions in a way where you wouldn't have to completely understand the concepts to answer the questions. So getting more the values that we wanted to hear about, and trying to separate it a little bit from how that relates back to flexible transit. So, having collected all that information, we now had an existing conditions report from everything the demographic data, bus ridership data, our information we had of the existing conditions of the area. The best practices report, like I said, was from stuff we got from other agencies and kind of how other people were doing things. And our community outreach report was all the stuff that we collected from the community and their feedbacks. So all this went into our alternatives creation process. So just to show you an example of some of the data that I've talked about, this is boarding data for Keizer neighborhood. As you can see, there's a transit center right there with high number of boardings. This major corridor in the middle has a lot of boardings, but some of those loops on the outer edges don't really have a lot of boardings. Mainly, it's a suburban grid, and a lot of those people would have to transfer to the main line to use it, and there's not a lot of coverage, and it only hits one local street within that gridded or non-gridded area. So, it's kind of difficult to imagine people going through a lot of these loops and lollipops, if you will, to get to a neighborhood street that may only be a quarter mile away from them in Euclidean distance, but a lot farther from them when they're actually walking the streets. So like I said earlier, this is an example of the data we got in terms of rider destinations that were popular, and then we tried identifying what these places were to get a sense for where the community was going and what was important to them. And all this information went into creating 6 different features for flexible transit that we then would apply to the route in each of the places. So the features that we used were stops, buffer, number of deviations, type of bus and capacity, frequency, and the ability to plan ahead. So with stops, activated stops was something we recommended system-wide. As I mentioned earlier, an activated stop is basically a point where people can go to turn on the stop to get collected to use the service. A variation of this, instead of an activated stop, another recommendation we looked at was curb-to-curb service, meaning that the bus would deviate off the road and go to your house or to your curb to pick you up. Obviously, there'd be a lot more time lost with that, and since we didn't see this service as something that would replace paratransit necessarily, we thought that we could ask people to walk a few blocks to activation points distributed throughout their neighborhood. The buffer depended on the area, and area specific, we chose a different buffer based on we tried meeting the target of 1-hour frequencies for all these lines. So how far could the bus deviate within an hour and still make the route? Number of deviations. So this is a little tricky. What we did here was we calculated, given the buffer that we thought made sense for the area, the number of deviations that a bus could do to the border of the buffer and back on average while meeting the frequency of the route. And to better illustrate this to the community, we used low, medium, and high, which are arbitrary terms that just show how these compare to each other relative to each other. So 0.7 deviations, for example, and below per mile was a low amount. Between 0.7 and 1.2 deviations was a middle amount, and above that was high. Minibuses were recommended system-wide for this system because we wanted something that could help maneuver down narrow streets and residential streets, but also have significant capacity to pick people up and have room for the amount of current riders that we're seeing there today, if not more. Given the low ridership that exists in those areas, we thought a capacity of 22 would be just fine, and that we did not need a full-size bus to serve these areas. For the activation of the stop, this one says optional. This has to do with the type of service, whether it was a deviator or a hopper. A deviator, it would be optional because you could use a fixed stop that's on the regular line as well, while a hopper you would have to call in because there was no existing stops. So to give you a better idea of how this plays into things, we created recommendations or alternatives for each study area with routes using these features for each of the lines. And this was a poster that we had at our open house, which is where we took our recommendations to the community to get some feedback. So we had 3 alternatives for each study area. This is an example of one of them. You have a deviator down here with a buffer zone, as you can see, and a hopper up top, which is just a open zone where someone could call in and it's completely demand responsive to get you to the transit center to then be able to transfer and use the system. So we tried keeping the amount of service hours used equivalent to what was there before, but introducing this new kind of service instead. So at the open house, we got feedback, and we got pretty positive reception on these different concepts. We realized that a lot of people were excited about this, but didn't really have a preference between a lot of the options. Some of them we saw clear preferences. Other ones, we got the sense that people felt like it was our job to make that decision and not theirs in terms of which one would serve them better, which is an interesting takeaway in terms of people's views on transit and the accessibility of understanding transit options fully. So here's another example of those maps at our open house. Then we also took these same alternative recommendations and went to a bus driver focus group where we got feedback from the drivers in terms of how feasible they thought the recommendations that we had made were in terms of their day-to-day operations and any red flags or anything that they saw. We got very positive reception. We were actually pretty surprised. We thought we'd get a little more pushback from the drivers because this would add a lot more stress on their day-to-day operations and a lot more variability in terms of having to think about multiple other things than they already have to do, and their job's already pretty stressful. Obviously, it would come with a lot of training to be able to run this kind of service, but people seem pretty open to the idea. So like I said, we came up with the 3 different alternatives for each study area, and we've been working to boil those down to one recommendation to give to the agency for the service. In addition to the on-the-ground features and routes, we've been recommending things like vehicle type and stop type of how they should work. For example, here's an example from MVTA where the letters on the map are scheduled times where the bus will be there, so they're fixed stops with scheduled times, while the other dots that look like little targets, where they call flag stops, are fixed stops on the line that have no scheduled time. So the way that would work is the bus would be able to deviate in this zone between A and B as long as it came back and hit the flag stops somewhere between the window of when it's supposed to be at A and at B. So that adds for a little more flexibility of being able to pick people up within the whole zone. So obviously, depending on how you create the system, you lose some predictability in terms of getting more flexibility. So we did like the concept that MVTA used here of having intermediate stops that did not have schedules. And given how short some of our routes are, we thought it worked well because it would still give people a small enough window that fell into what values people have of how long they were willing to wait for a bus. So we used that information to figure out how far we can place these stops and still have people use the service. So activated stops, like I mentioned earlier, here's a map of what that would look like. So this whole zone would have dots that could be activated for people to get picked up at. Planning ahead, we heard from the community that they would like to be able to plan as little as 1 to 2 hours in advance. So that's part of our recommendation. We are recommending to them that they use a computer-based dispatch system to help do this for the service, which would allow people to call in or text in or go online to let the dispatcher know that they would like to schedule a stop to get turned on 1 or 2 hours in advance. So it would require a little planning ahead to use the deviated services, but definitely not as much as the paratransit that's currently there, which requires 24 hours. Here's just a list of other things that we gave recommendations on. I'm not going to get into all of them today, but we tried to give a pretty comprehensive overview of what they needed to know to implement this service. And a lot of this stuff came from our best practices mixed with what we heard from the community. So like I said, we are putting all this into a flexible transit plan that's going to Salem-Keizer. It's being reviewed by them now, and it'll be basically taken to the transit board later in June, and they'll have a chance to vote on it to see if they want to adopt it for a pilot project in the area. And another thing that we're doing is we're making a flexible transit system development guidebook, which is meant for other agencies to have access to this information, to see what we did and how it worked, to be able to shape how they do it in the future. All right, and that's my project, and thank you to my group mates for coming. They're also here to help answer any questions, since there's a lot of moving parts of this project, and we each have a little specialization in something different. But Thank you. Yes.
My name is Wayne Corrick. Just a question, has Chariot indicated at all what sort of trial period? By the way, I love this idea. I think it's great, the middle ground between the two. Have they indicated any trial period that they would allow for success before they say, sorry, the ridership's not improving, we're just going to throw this route to the wolves?
So they actually haven't talked to us about how long they're willing to wait to see how this works, but we're recommending to them based on how long other pilot projects lasted in other places. I believe it's 6 to 18 months window in terms of. Okay. So that's our recommendation to them, to start with one study area, see how it goes, and then implement the other two. Yes.
My name is Alicia, first name, last name Holloway. I wanted to ask you what specifically was like the feedback in terms of positive and negative, and then also if you have any information on successful projects in other areas.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So your first question, I would say in terms of positive feedback, a lot of people really liked the deviator. People like the idea of expanded coverage. We got especially positive feedback from people with disabilities and seniors, talking about how that they had hills to climb, too much distance to walk to get to their bus stop, and that as the aging in place issue grows and they feel like they can't drive for much longer, that even for wealthier seniors in the community, they express the need and desire for transit in their neighborhood. So that was definitely something that was very positive. Negative feedback, I would say that our project was a little overshadowed by the issue that there's no weekend service in Salem, and that was cut a few years ago. So a lot of the negative feedback we got was aimed at saying that this shouldn't be the priority of the agency and that they should be focused on bringing back weekend service. But that's a whole nother issue that's a lot more political and has a lot more funding requirements as well. So we tried bringing back the issue to what we were talking about. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marisa Demal. I wanted to ask you actually about the financials. What are the short-term and long-term effects of a project like this in terms of the city budget?
So what we are trying to do is our goal is to minimize that, because the agency came to us looking for a service that they could implement without spending much more than they're spending currently. And kind of the trade-off that they saw is that they're trying to reach more of an area with minimal increase in budget. I don't think they're strictly saying that they don't want it to increase. So a lot of our service was aimed at keeping it the same in terms of the service hours. The big issue in terms of costliness is labor. There might be, obviously need for additional dispatchers and call center workers, and bus drivers might have to be contracted through a different contract that does flexible transit, depending on, those are details that we haven't really looked into. But if those issues do come up, it could be a lot costlier in terms of labor, so that's something they need to look into further.
Is there a need for new buses, for new vehicles?
So they're actually, right now, the Cherry Lift service, the paratransit service that they run, would be able to supply vehicles for a pilot project. But in terms of future implementation, they're actually have a big chunk of their fleet that's getting at a retirement age for their buses. So it would be a good time for them to kind of think about what their system looks like in terms of their fleet as they look to renew that. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
My name is Dirk Kinsey. I was curious about the user costs and just kind of what your recommendations were for that.
Yeah. So kind of what we saw at other agencies, there's a huge variation of how much people charge for the service, whether it's more or not more at all. We are actually recommending that there's no additional charge for the deviations. And our justification for that comes out of the fact that a lot of these services in other places are put in place to add the coverage for those who need it, but not necessarily incentivize the use of it, while Chariots is trying to get people to use this service, especially people who may be using paratransit instead because the cost of that is skyrocketing for them, to get the paratransit users that are capable of using a system that requires a little bit of distance to travel, but not as much as their current fixed route. So we're hoping that by having no charge, extra charge beyond the regular bus service, and given the gap of in terms of how much more expensive paratransit is, that'll help lower the cost of paratransit by people using this system.
On the same financial issue, wondering if, in addition to all the meetings and workshops with the bus drivers and the community members and everything, if there was another forum, regular exchange, communication with the administration, the officials that would be saying yes or no to this plan?
So we've worked extensively with the transit agency themselves. We've had a chance to talk to some board members, but the board members haven't been spoken to in an official capacity. Just they've come to a lot of our events and been updated on this project as it's going on. A lot of our guidance in terms of what to expect from the decision-making board has come from the agency staff themselves. So we have been in talks with them about making sure that this is something they're interested in before going on this endeavor.
Who will be deciding the success or failure of this system? Who's analyzing it? Who gets final say?
That's a really good question. So part of that is yet to be determined, but we envision that being Salem-Keizer Transit themselves as a staff. At the end of the day, these are their funds that they'll choose to put towards this, and at any moment they could decide that it's not working or they want to put their funds elsewhere. So an issue that we've seen in terms of looking at best practices is comprehensive performance standards and performance measures of how to evaluate these systems. There's not a whole lot out there. I think Denver has done a decent job of evaluating these kinds of systems, but there's still a lot of gray area in terms of what's the best way to do that. Yeah.
My name is Gregory Kirkland, and I was wondering about any kind of backlash you might have had from riders that are happy with the way it is now and they don't see that there needs to be any change, like people that have been using it for years and they're scared to change it.
Yeah.
Did you get any backlash from that?
We definitely did. There's definitely people who, one, are afraid of change, but two, I would think rightfully so, because a lot of change that they've seen due to the budget issue has been fairly negative. This can, I think, be misinterpreted at times for an excuse of cutting service in terms of their bus coming less frequently or other features that come with a fixed route service being diminished. But obviously the trade-off is coverage, which we tried to communicate as effectively as we could. But obviously there's always going to be a little bit of backlash there. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about real-time tracking? I mean, presumably with this, people will depend more on it than they would with regular service.
Mm-hmm. So yes, real-time tracking is something that we are recommending that they implement potentially further down the line. Right now, they don't have the GPS technology to do that. We're hoping that depending on what system they go with for their dispatching system, that could be something that could easily be added. But it still could be a little bit of time before that is implemented. It is obviously very important for a system like this. One catch, though, in terms of this population, from what we learned from talking to people and our survey results, not a lot of people have smartphones or access to texting or the internet. Texting and internet were a lot higher than smartphones, but the population wouldn't really have, or a lot of the transit riders wouldn't really have the ability to check in real time when they're out and about anyway. So although it would be very useful to have that kind of service, we don't know that it's necessarily crucial given the lack of user access to receiving that data. Yeah.
I was wondering for like the call to ride one, or one that would pick them up at their house, that service. My name's Daniel Stein, sorry. Do they have like a route optimization software, or is it more up to the bus driver's discretion how he or she gets to point A to B?
Yeah, it's a good question. So part of our recommendations are a dispatching software that would basically create the routes for them. A pilot project could potentially be done with routing by hand by the dispatcher and sending it, either doing a call to the driver where he can mark the stops that are being activated on a piece of paper if they want to go very low budget. But they do have a bit of technology in a software called Route Match there currently for their paratransit service. So they would just need something with higher capability above that to be able to fully do this for a system like this. But yeah, there's definitely software that would be able to do that for you. Yeah.
Deviations, is there a certain point where the bus drivers would have to start ignoring additional requests because it's taking too long to get?
That's a really good question. So yeah, part of what happens is, so with reservations, there would be a 1 or 2 hour in advance requirement, but it would also be what we are calling first come, first serve. So you could have, we haven't set the number of days, but X number of days ahead of time where you can call in and make reservations. If a certain time is very popular, it could be that it fills up, and even if you call 2 or 3 hours in advance, you can't get that deviation scheduled. Part of what we're also recommending is a subscription service for commuters and people who want to make regular trips. So they can have a little more dependability of basically scheduling their trip ahead of time and knowing that that's regularly happening for them, and having to cancel instead of schedule when they can't make it. But part of our determining how many deviations can be done was looking at the demand and figuring out for each of these areas what made sense in terms of the buffer versus the number of deviations that would be allowed, and the ridership that's in that area to try to, we don't expect right away for them to max out at the number of deviations on every run, maybe at commute times in some of the areas, but we'll see. Yes?
I just had a question about whether you considered combining these features with other transportation solutions that may be like shared ride solutions or like e-bike sharing, bike sharing, car sharing.
Those kinds of considerations did come to mind, but for this project, given our client and their interests and the wide scope that exists in flexible transit, we didn't really have time to look into a lot of that, and they seem more interested in trying to provide the last mile issue with their fleet themselves rather than looking externally to other types of services. Yeah.
Question about vehicles. Are there vehicle designs that we just don't have out there at the moment that would help solve some of these problems? Because the standard buses and the minibuses are kind of limiting. I'm just wondering if you guys talked about that at all.
We didn't really talk about that too much, but one thing I will note off of that comment is that there are features of minibuses that a lot of agencies don't have. For example, at the chairlift buses that they use for paratransit right now, they use a lift for wheelchairs, which can delay the service up to several minutes in terms of picking people up, which would throw the whole system off. There are low-floor minibuses that are now being made that are being implemented in other places where this would help alleviate that by working more like a full-size bus where you can have a ramp instead of a complete lift to get someone with a wheelchair on the service. So little things like that and technologies are definitely recommendations that we're making in terms of how to make the minibuses work best for this system. So.
Minibuses manufactured in the U.S.?
I believe so. They're used in the U.S. I don't remember if they're manufactured in the U.S. Yeah.
Nice job. I'm impressed with what you did in the time. And this is a pretty small question, but your answer to the previous question made me wonder when you talk about people making reservations and things like that. In the other systems that you looked at where they've implemented this, is it a problem of people making reservations and not showing up?
So yes, there's
that in some way?
So there different systems actually have different rules for how to deal with that, and there's actually I think I forget what agency, but one of our case studies has a 3 strikes rule, for example, where you're no longer allowed to use the service after 3 times of not showing up and not canceling ahead of time. So it would require to implement something like that more information from the user than just a phone call. We'd have to ask for a name or phone number, a way to register that, so there's trade-offs of that. What we're recommending here is that the chairlift paratransit system already has rules for that, so we're just recommending that they carry that over for this system as well. Yeah.
Again, in terms of locations where something like this has been implemented successfully, do you have any data on that?
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot the second part of your question last time. CJ, do you want to kind of speak to some of the different case studies?
The one that a lot of people refer to is Denver. They have a flexible transit service called Call and Ride with over 20 different service areas over 8 counties. And they also have a really great example of evaluating the service as well. Outside of that, there are dozens of agencies that are implementing this, and from what we've seen a lot of these agencies adopt and implement these kind of services more recently in the last decade to last 15 years, and a lot of them are still in operations now. A couple other examples of it, one here at home, which we didn't really get a chance to look at, is Forest Grove just implemented this kind of service as well. Eugene has a service like this. Utah has a service. Minnesota Valley Transportation Authority has this. DART service in Houston has it. So there's a lot of places where this has been used. I think the biggest thing is that you need to do a lot of community outreach and make sure that the community is open and understands how this would work. Otherwise, it would be perceived as a change in the system, and it makes it a little harder to get rolling and off the ground. Does that answer your question?
So a lot of locations have it, but they don't know anything about success.
Well, I mean, in terms of success, it varies because there's so many different levers in this, and there isn't enough out there for there to be consistent information as to like, oh, if you do it this way, you can expect these results, because each system is so unique and so customized to meet the needs and demands of that area that you're kind of going into it with the expectation that you know it's going to perform better than paratransit, but not as well as fixed route service. And so you get that range of whatever those parameters are for your service, you can expect that in that area.
And going off of that, I would say that I think that the purpose of these systems differ in different places, so it's kind of hard to evaluate success without looking at what their goals were. And I think, flexible transit is implemented for various reasons in different places. So that makes it a little hard to compare and a little more difficult than just purely looking at, ridership increase. That means it was successful, because it could be purely based on, coverage and wanting to get people in places that didn't have access before having access to it. So you might not necessarily be looking for a pure number increase, but more dispersed numbers or something like that. Matt, did you have something you wanted to add?
Building off that, we did find examples of places that implemented flexible transit and then taken it away. So there's definitely a lot of variability. Some places it's too successful and they actually can't let any more people onto the system, make reservations because there's so many people using it. Other places it doesn't work. And I think the big thing for us was reaching out to the community and kind of like what CJ was saying, and finding what would actually work for Salem-Keizer to increase the chance for success. And then that's also why we want to have the pilot project, so we can get people used to the idea, learn lessons from it, build off of it, and then expand it to the whole system.
And I think a lot of the success hinges on making sure you're serving the right things in right places. So making sure activated stops are placed correctly, going to community needs of, destinations that people want to get to but aren't getting to by transit. So yeah, we'll see how it goes in Salem-Keizer, hopefully. Any other questions? Yeah.
How is public perception of this type of flexible transit in other areas that have implemented it?
That's a good question. I think the answer to that is a little lacking because a lot of places haven't done a lot of public outreach, which is what makes this project unique, I think. And so a lot of those agencies don't have that answer beyond looking at ridership data and what's happening. I don't know if anyone has anything to add on that.
What was the question again?
What's the public perception of this in other agencies? But
I would have said exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I think that data just doesn't, unfortunately, really exist. So.
People do it, but it's not well documented.
Yeah.
My name is Nate Rochester, by the way, and I'm wondering if you have observed or anticipate any resistance from local private paratransit taxi companies that might stand to have something to lose.
Yeah. We have not, and we have not really engaged taxi companies in the area. We are kind of viewing it as, that's Salem-Keizer Transit's purview of figuring out their relationships with other service providers in the area. They wanted us to look into flexible transit options because they thought it was the best way to help serve their system. I would say, though, that we have thought a little bit about how this matches up with school bus service in the area. And making sure that we're not going out of our way to duplicate that, since there's, I believe, potential for tension there between the agency and school bus services, depending on service changes done by the transit agency. Yeah.
Just in terms of an earlier question, I heard like logistics and having ridden on buses, in particular when there's traffic. Do you have anything planned for, say, there's a delay, the person's there, you said 3 strikes, you're out if you're not there, and say there's a delay, the first bus, you've been waiting a couple hours, doesn't show up, they send another one, they let you know there's backup, etc. And then it arrives, the initial one picks you up, and then the second one that they sent out, and then you're not there. Is there some way that you're going to be able to communicate when they've deviated and picked the individual up for, those types of logistical problems that...
I think the way that a lot of agencies deal with that is looking at, obviously if it goes beyond a certain window, then it falls on the agency, not you. So if you don't get picked up within your window and they come and you're not there, I don't think you're liable anymore. So whether you got picked up by a different service because something was sent out or whatever it may be, you're just required to be there within your wait window. So if another bus shows up and you're no longer there because you got picked up because your wait window passed and something else came, then obviously that's not your fault. So I think that there are measures in place to make sure that those things are accounted for. Yeah.
My name's Tom Mills. You had mentioned that one means of getting cost savings would be a reduction in the paratransit service usage. In your research, have you found that to be the case with other agencies that have done this? Have they seen a significant reduction in their paratransit usage in the area where it's been implemented?
I feel like CJ could speak to that better than I can.
So it varies. There hasn't been a ton of research indicating whether or not that's the case. A lot of it's anecdotal right now and uncorrelated. But they have seen in places where they've implemented flexible transit that there have been an increase in ridership when they do marketing and education targeted at people who ride it. But the actual cost savings of it is pretty marginal, just because the shift is the shift in ridership is pretty small.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we thank Darwin and the whole Paradigm Planning team, just want to remind you that next week we have Professor Mike Lowry from the University of Idaho talking about GIS tools for bicycle network analysis and planning. So let's thank our speakers.